In this video, I'm going to be talking about the 6 books that I read in May. I'm going to start off with my favorite read for the month of May, and that was a nonfiction book called Tyranny of the Minority by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. I listened to this as an audiobook, but then I picked up a physical copy from my local library. So Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt are both professors at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and they've written another book which I actually plan to read this month, which is called How Democracies Die. So in that book, they look at the ways in which democracies end and sort of turn into authoritarian regimes. And then in this book, they look at part of the issues specifically with the American Constitution, which have resulted in there being very strong minorities who are able to dictate a lot of things that happen within American society. So I actually expected this book to be just about America, but it actually has a much larger scope. One of the professors, his area of expertise is Latin America, and then the other professor, I believe it's Europe. So they include lots of examples from other countries in the world about similar instances that have happened both historically and present day. So the beginning of the book is really looking at this issue of minority rule throughout the world, and then they look at American history and really take you through the end of the Civil War, the Reconstruction era, which gave a lot of rights to African Americans, and then the very strong minority of people who didn't want African Americans to become powerful, and sort of the backlash and repercussions of that, notably like Jim Crow laws, segregation, and that sort of thing, which really only improved in the 1960s. They also talked in this book about the change in the political parties, because originally it was the Democrats who were very much like the slave party, whereas the Republicans were seen to be more sort of liberal. And so they talked also about like the change in those parties and how that happened in American history. And then they look at the present day issues, notably Trump and the Republican Party, and sort of how that arose, why Republican Party members are supporting Trump, and then also issues within the American Constitution which explain why such a strong minority is able to really dictate the political landscape in America. So there's one section in particular that I just want to read where they talk about some of the institutions, and they call them counter-majoritarian institutions, really institutions that prevent majority rule from really dictating how things go. And so some of the counter-majoritarian institutions that they talk about include the Bill of Rights, the fact that the Supreme Court has lifetime appointments for judges, the Senate, which gives all states the same representation regardless of population, the filibuster, which allows a partisan minority to permanently block legislation backed by the majority, the Electoral College, which is an indirect system of electing presidents, and it privileges smaller states and allows essentially people to become president even though they don't have the popular vote. And the supermajority rules for constitutional change, which requires a 2/3 vote of each House of Congress, plus approval by 3/4 of the US. And then the rest of the book is really the authors going into a lot of detail about those different institutions and ways in which those institutions can possibly be changed. So I really enjoyed this book. It was very detailed, gave a lot of understanding of the American political system and American Constitution. And one thing that was really interesting is because they sort of show history and then also show other countries, they show that, you know, some of the issues with the American system and with the American Constitution are not unique to America. What is unique is that right now, and they said this has really been going on for the last 50 years or so, there's this idea that the American Constitution is perfect and shouldn't be changed. And part of what they say is, you know, constitutions frequently get changed. Some of the issues that other countries have had that are similar to what's happening in America, they've been changed over time. So it's not that it needs to be stuck in stone. And then they also talk about, you know, some of the things that were done, such as the Electoral College, that was a compromise. It actually was the third choice of the creators of the Constitution, and some things were also done as a compromise in order to keep the southern states as part of the Union. So things that were done as a compromise then doesn't mean that they need to be around forever, especially if it looks like it's not working. And so, for example, the Electoral College, which, like I said, was the third choice, it was an experiment. And if the experiment is not working, it's okay to look into other options. So really interesting, fascinating book. Also helpful if you want to understand, why the Republican Party is backing someone like Trump and not really doing anything to stop him. So yeah, very timely, very interesting, very well written and easy to understand. Like I said, I listened to it as an audiobook. I don't think I would have liked it as much if I didn't, because there's so much information and it's very easy to get bogged down. But overall, yeah, I thought this was a really good book. It was I would say fantastic, and I would highly recommend it. So the next book I want to talk about, I just want to say, I don't know if this really should be at number 2. I put it at number 2 because I felt like it gave me so much information that was really helpful right now, but I don't really think that was necessarily because of the book itself. I think it's just the content was very relevant to what I wanted. And the second book was The Trump Indictments by Melissa Murray and Andrew Weissman. So Murray and Weissman are both law school professors at NYU. And they wrote this book talking about the 4 Trump indictments. So I'm not going to get into the specific cases because I really am just going to be talking about the book in general. But I do just want to read off the 4 cases that they cover so that you have an idea what it's about. I'm going to read it off so I don't miss anything. So they talk about the DC January 6th indictment, which was brought by special counsel Jack Smith. And that really is looking at holding Trump accountable for his efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election. Also looks at the election interference case in Georgia, which is very similar to the DC indictment, but is brought in the state of Georgia. That one also is much, much, much more detailed than the DC case. Then they also look at the classified documents case, which was also brought by special counsel Jack Smith. And in the news, this is the one that they talk about where Trump took classified documents to one of his properties in Mar-a-Lago, Florida. And then the last case that they talk about is the hush money case, the Stormy Daniels case happening in New York City. That's the one where Trump was just convicted very recently. So what the book does is takes those 4 indictments and then includes an introduction written by the authors, and then they have a section talking about all of the people involved in the case. That would include other co-accused or defendants, other people who were just involved in some way. I also talk in detail about the prosecutors that are bringing the case and about Trump's defense counsel who was involved. And then you have the actual indictments themselves, and they essentially have footnotes throughout with the authors giving their own opinion or giving little tidbits of information that are helpful to allow you to understand the indictments a little bit more. And so the indictments themselves are really the documents written by the prosecution explaining really the case that they're bringing against Trump, the charges, all of that sort of thing. So there are 4 of them, and they're written by different lawyers, so some were a little bit more interesting to read than others. I'd say the hush money one and the Mar-a-Lago ones were the 2 most interesting. The Georgia one, oh my gosh, that one was so long and not the most interesting read. It was just pages and pages and pages. But it's helpful because it really breaks down, on this particular day, Trump called this person and tried to convince them, I just need 11,000 more votes. It breaks that sort of thing down day by day. For some of them, the Georgia one, there's co-defendants, which include Giuliani. So they're also breaking down things that other people are doing, which is part of the reason it's so extensive. So very helpful in terms of reference, but not the most exciting thing to sit down and read. So I read the actual book because there was no audiobook for this, and I read it as an ebook. So now talking about my thoughts about this book. I didn't love it. I felt like there wasn't enough analysis to justify the cost because the indictments are available for free, in the public domain. So you're really paying for the footnotes sort of sections, the introduction, and the cast of characters that the lawyers talk about. I don't know, maybe because I'm very much a DIY person, I feel like a lot of what they talked about I could have just figured out for myself by looking at like articles and watching the news. Like, it didn't really feel like they brought that much to the table that I wouldn't be able to get from alternative sources for free. What's nice about this is it's all in one place, and I think for myself, I probably would have never sat down and actually read the Indictments if they hadn't been in a book. So if you're that sort of person where like you're a little bit more motivated to read books as opposed to maybe like court decisions or something like that, then this is definitely a good way to force yourself to read it. But yeah, I don't really think there was tons of analysis that really justified the cost. And then I'm really focusing right now on like media literacy and really being aware of people's bias, possible conflicts of interest when they're providing you with information. So I came across this book because one of the authors, Melissa Murray, she is a co-host on this podcast, Strict Scrutiny, and that's a podcast with 3 female law school professors talking about different Supreme Court cases in America. I'll be honest, it's not my favorite podcast on that sort of issue, but it is one that I listen to every now and then. And I was listening to one of their episodes and they talked about this book. But what I didn't realize is that both Melissa and Andrew are regular contributors to MSNBC. And if you're not American, like I'm not American, so I don't really watch a lot of American news, but recently I have been. And I've actually been watching quite a bit of MSNBC, and I really do not like that channel. It just seems very biased, very anti-Trump, and very pro-Biden, which is fair, but there's not a ton of analysis, not a ton of criticism of Biden, or really anything that the Democrats are doing, which is fair, but I think you just need to be aware of that when you're watching it. So for me, when I was reading this book, it just felt like there wasn't really any criticism about anything that was going on. And I had listened to a few other podcasts by either lawyers or law school professors talking about the Trump indictments, and most of them had said the hush money trial was fairly weak. They would be surprised if it would be successful, and if it was successful, they felt like there would be grounds for appeal. And I didn't really feel like I got that sort of analysis in this book. Like, it would have just been helpful to get a little bit of more background information. And again, I'm not really going to get into the case necessarily, but from the little bits and pieces that I've been reading, I think that there are definitely things that Trump's legal team could use to sort of just appeal it in general, but then also reasons why it possibly could be appealed. And again, I'm not an expert in this at all, so I don't want what I say to be gospel, but I just would have liked to see that sort of analysis from these law school professors who are talking about these cases. And like, for example, Andrew Weissman actually has an MSNBC podcast that's all about prosecuting Donald Trump. So it just doesn't seem like they're the most like neutral authors to write about this topic. So I kind of feel like, I don't know, it kind of felt like just like an MSNBC pitch as to why Trump should be indicted all of these times without any real like criticism or analysis about whether some of these are maybe political and there are possible criticisms to some of these indictments that were brought. So those are my overall thoughts about the book. Like I said, I really put it as number 2 because I was really looking for information about these Trump indictments. It was very timely and it was a very easy way to get that information. But in terms of the book itself, I probably would have rated the book a little bit lower in terms of the actual book and the writing and whether I thought it was really worth your money. So the next book I want to talk about is fiction, and it is called I'm a Fan by Sheena Patel. So this book I actually had come across a few months ago, and I had requested it from my local library, and then it became available, so that's why I read it last month. This novel, we follow the life of an unnamed narrator. We don't know a ton about her, but we know she is a woman of color in a long-term relationship with her partner, who I believe is white, and she is cheating on her boyfriend with a man who is married. But then, as an added layer, the man who's married that she's having this affair with, he is having an affair with multiple women. And this woman is sort of at the bottom of the totem pole when it comes to his mistresses. For example, there'll be times where they have plans to meet up and he'll cancel because he's like, this other woman is in town and I just am so drawn to her, I need to spend time with her and not you. And so it's a very interesting dynamic that is going on. Another layer to this is the fact that the narrator is essentially obsessed with one of the other women this man is sleeping with, and that's why it's called I'm a Fan. She is constantly stalking her on social media, especially Instagram, tracking her everyday life, sometimes even trying to put herself in situations where she could potentially bump into this woman. So it's a really interesting story. I don't think I've ever come across something like this before, and it meditates on a lot of really interesting ideas. Definitely social media and the influence of social media on us and on society as a whole. Also looks at things like status, class, quite a bit of a discussion about race also. Then also conversations about patriarchy and about misogyny. The male character in this book is definitely extremely misogynistic. So yeah, we have an analysis of him as a person, and then also interesting to look into, try and understand why anyone would put themselves in this sort of situation when it's so clear that he doesn't value her as a person. So this is Sheena Patel's debut novel, and I would say for her first novel, this was incredible and really set a high standard for what a debut novel should be like. It's very unique, very original, and unlike anything I've ever really come across. It does fall within that sort of category of very unlikable female characters, which I tend to enjoy those novels because they just are a bit different than other things you come across. The character is very much not a damsel in distress. Like, she's very aware of what she's doing. And yeah, it was a very interesting book. I want to just read my favorite quote because there are quite a few quotes that really stood out for me, but I wanted to just give you a little bit of an idea of Patel's writing style because I thought it was really unique. I also just wanted to say that this book is British, and it definitely has a very British vibe to it, if you know what I mean. We second-generation immigrants have the privilege of self-actualization. We make sculptures, direct films, write plays, novels, memoirs, and poems about not having a home, of trying to find a home, of being between two types of home. What is home? Of how we all feel ugly, of the mixed relationships we enter into with white people, losing our language from a culture we had a tenuous hold of in the first place. We tell the story of being acted upon. We speak from the position of the victim. I would say that chapter as a whole I really enjoyed. There are lots of really interesting comments about being a second-generation immigrant and creating art, and how often we tend to write art which is really vulnerable and talks about our experience, but is that a good thing? So yeah, really interesting debut novel, fairly short. I listened to this as an audiobook again. I actually think I probably also would have liked it as a physical book. I didn't realize the chapters were really short. You don't quite get that when you're listening to the audiobook, with really funny titles too. Like, one of the chapter titles was, first of all, I didn't miss the red flags. I looked at them and thought, yeah, that's sexy. So just very tongue-in-cheek, interesting contemporary novel. I think the one criticism I would have, and this is more just personal preference, is some parts of it were quite vulgar, and I was listening to this in the middle of the day and I was oh, don't really know if I needed to have that very explicit sex scene right now. So that's the one thing I didn't love about it, but that again is just my personal preference. Nothing against the book itself. So next was another novel I read, and that was 1984 by George Orwell. This was my second time reading this. I read this back in high school a very long time ago, and it's probably the one novel I read in high school that really stuck with me. Just the general overall ideas. Again, I'm not really gonna get too much into the plot, but it really follows this one character named Winston, who is living in this dystopian society, in this totalitarian regime where there is this party that's in charge and he's a member of the party, and the party really dictates everything about everyone's lives. It's where this idea of Big Brother is watching you comes from. Very much a surveillance state where you have to have absolute loyalty to the party, otherwise you will be like exterminated essentially. You know, children spy on their parents and report their parents if they don't have absolute loyalty towards the party. There's a lot of propaganda, misinformation, that sort of thing. And I don't know how to feel about this book. I feel like I liked the ideas that Orwell was exploring. These ideas of, you know, censorship, surveillance, authoritarianism, lack of freedom, and what that does to society and what that does to people. But I will say I didn't love the reading experience, which is why it's so low on the list. It starts off actually quite slow and it really takes until this like one particular part, which again is almost like a story in a story, that I really liked. It's not even just that it's slow, it also lacks, I don't know, not character, but just, there's just something missing. I can't quite put my finger on it, but something that prevented me from like absolutely loving this novel. But I did really enjoy a lot of the concepts and themes that Orwell's talking about, the idea of surveillance, state surveillance, and what that does to a society, the ideas of propaganda. He also deals with this idea of like history and rewriting history and what does it mean when we can't even really trust the history that's being recorded. All things that I think are really interesting and telling, especially with what's going on right now in Israel-Palestine. Also this idea of doublethink, and it's really this concept of like having two things that are contradictory but saying it as if it's not. So for example, in this society you have the Ministry of Truth, which is all about propaganda, rewriting history, and telling lies. You have the Ministry of Love, which is all about torture and extermination of people. Having these ideas and really also having words that just then essentially lose their meaning. Like, what is truth if the Ministry of Truth is dealing with lies, right? And that again is very much something I feel like that's going on right now. Even when I think of the Biden administration using words like ceasefire, but when you actually look at what they're talking about, it's not a ceasefire. They're taking the word ceasefire and changing the meaning and expecting people to not realize that that's what they're doing. Like, words need to have meaning that stays consistent. What does it mean as a society when we're taking these words and changing their meaning as a way to sort of trick people and not have them realize what you're actually doing? But overall, I liked this. I'm trying to read books that are about like media literacy and understanding the media establishment. I am very slowly working through Manufacturing Consent by Chomsky, which is like not an easy read at all. But I feel like some of the ideas and concepts in that book are dealt with by Orwell in this novel, and so I feel like a novel is a much easier way to grasp some of those ideas than a nonfiction book. So in that sense, I really think that it was a really interesting novel, and I would highly recommend it if you've never read it before. I'm still on the fence, but I kind of think I prefer Animal Farm, which is another book by Orwell. Animal Farm was actually the first book I read this year, and I really liked it. It was really short, punchy, to the point, and I also really like stories that are like a parable or allegory. I find them really fascinating. And I think Animal Farm is something that, you know, you can read in high school and still get it, but then you can read it as an adult and just like unlock a whole new level to it. I don't really think you get that with 1984. I think it's sort of you get what you get, but a really interesting book nonetheless. Okay, now I'm getting into the books I didn't really love so much this month. So the first one is East of Eden. So I'm not going to get into this a ton because I have a very detailed review where I talk about it at length, but this is a book written by John Steinbeck, and it follows the life of this one family over multiple generations who are living out in California. It's a really long book. It's around 600 pages, but it's very plot heavy, so there's a lot that happens in the book. So I would say if you're someone who's been a bit nervous to do a classic, especially a long classic, this would be a good one to start with, because to me it actually doesn't really read like most classics. I feel like a lot of classics are very, very slow. This one, there's like so much happening in the plot. To me, it's actually something I didn't like about the book. It just made it a little bit unbelievable and unrealistic. But if you're someone who doesn't really read novels a lot, I think this is a really good one to start with because there's so much going on which keeps you engaged. Like, I finished this over like 2.5 days or so because I was quite interested to see where it would go. It has somewhat of an exploration of the ideas of good and evil and the duality of man, so that was really the main reason I chose to read the book. And I think it had like a fairly good analysis or exploration of that topic. I would also say it was like quite ahead of its time. It deals with things like sex work, also has like a minority character who actually is quite complex. And yeah, like I said, it deals with an interesting philosophical concept. I just didn't really like it. It felt a little bit melodramatic, a bit like a soap opera, and that for me just like really took away from the book. And I didn't really like the characters. Not that the characters were unlikable, they were unlikable, but that's not what I mean. More so that I didn't really feel like the characters were necessarily realistic. It felt like they were a little bit inconsistent with the things that they did, and I would say that that's a flaw of the author. And I really like complex characters where the author sort of explains why they do what they do, helps us understand the complexity of human beings, and I didn't really feel like Steinbeck gave me that. So overall, a good book, but not great, but definitely good if you are trying to get into classics and are a little bit intimidated by a long classic. So the last book I want to talk about is Finding Me, a memoir, which is Viola Davis's memoir or autobiography. I again listened to this as an audiobook, and yeah, I really did not like it. It's not that it's bad. It's not that it's bad. I feel like I have a very love-hate relationship with autobiographies. In general, I say that I like the genre, but I would say I either love an autobiography or I hate it. There's like no in between. And unfortunately, this was one I just didn't like. I was hoping I would get a better understanding of Viola Davis, sort of a lot of the decisions that she made, why she chose to become an actress, why she chose some of the roles that she did. And I got that. Don't get me wrong, I got that, but I almost like wasn't satisfied with her answers and her analysis. Yeah, I didn't really get a lot out of it, and I also didn't necessarily agree with some of the things that she was saying. She talked about the fact that as an actor, a lot of the time actors will get criticized for the roles that they choose. And she says that if you don't come from a place of privilege, you don't have a lot of choice. A lot of people are actually unable to work full-time as an actor because it's so hard to get a role. And so that sort of criticism can only really be given to people who are wealthy and have a choice. But for the average person, you just have to take any role that you get, which was interesting. But I think that that is the sort of thing that people can say about a lot of areas. And I mean, I'm a lawyer, and I think people use that to justify why they work in big firms and do jobs that they don't necessarily agree with, because it's a way for them to sustain themselves in their lives. But I don't know, sometimes I think that's a bit of a cop-out. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I think you could probably just live with less. You don't need to be a millionaire. Maybe you just are, make like $200,000 or something and don't have a huge mansion. So I that sort of thing, I was like, I don't know if I agree with you, but I'm not an actor, so I don't really feel like I know that industry very well. But I think that is a little bit of a cop-out in general, and is a reason that people use to justify doing things that are probably like morally bad. But anyway, that's just one of my thoughts on her autobiography. So thank you for watching. I was actually pretty happy with my reading month in May, and funnily enough, I read 5 of those books the last week of May, because really East of Eden took a lot out of me and I didn't really have the energy to read anything else for a while after. So I'm glad I was able to still read a lot more books after and get some nonfiction in there also. So let me know in the comments if you have read any of these books, or if you have any recommendations for me. I'm always looking for new books to read. If you're new to this channel is all about re-education and decolonizing the mind. I'm currently on a journey of reading and learning lots of new things, and I created this channel as a way to share what I'm learning with the world. I have a few channels now, and this channel is all about the books that I'm reading. I also have a video essay channel, and lastly, I have a vlog channel where I talk about more sort of personal lifestyle things. So if you're interested in any of those, feel free to subscribe and give this a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.